The first snowfall of the season came on the morning of the Wexford Harvest Fair, and Eleanor Marsh stood at the edge of the green with a wren cupped in her bare hands, speaking to it in a low, even voice, while 3 women in good wool watched her as one watches a thing that has gone wrong. The bird had struck the glass of the assembly room and lay stunned on the cobbles, and she had knelt without thought, lifting it, warming it, telling it the cold was only cold, and that it would pass. The wren turned its head. It listened, or seemed to, the way small living things will fix on a steady sound. Behind her, the women did not lower their voices. The eldest of them, Mrs. Penhallow, said the word plainly as though it were a diagnosis, and not a cruelty. "Mad the girl talks to birds," she said, "and her sister with her, the 2 of them out at the marsh in all weathers. Mad as the tide." The wren shook itself and went up into the white air, and Eleanor watched it go, and did not turn around. She had learned long ago that turning around only gave them a face to remember. What the green did not know, what it had decided it did not need to know, was that Eleanor had not always been the woman who knelt on cobbles. There had been a house once, and a father, and a future arranged like silver on a cloth. There was a thing she carried now that she had told no one. You will want to know what it was. Stay with me, and you will. For the moment, it is enough to say that the wren was not the strangest message she would receive that winter, and that the man watching her from the inn yard across the green was about to become the second. He stood very still. That was the first thing about him. The stillness, the way a tall man holds himself when he has spent years learning not to be read. His coat was navy and very plain and cut by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and the snow settled on his shoulders, and he did not brush it away. He was the Duke of Aldous, lately come into the title, and the great cold house above the marsh, and the county had spent 3 weeks deciding he was proud. Eleanor did not know his name yet. She knew only that a gentleman had watched her speak to a dying bird, and had not laughed, and that this was rare enough to notice and dangerous enough to forget. She gathered her basket. She walked home along the sea wall with the snow coming down, and she did not let herself look back at the inn yard, though something in the back of her neck knew exactly where he stood. The cottage at the marsh edge was small and clean and cold, and Eleanor's sister, Beatrice, was at the window when she came in, watching the gulls wheel over the gray water with the particular attention that the village had decided was an affliction. Beatrice was 22 years younger than Eleanor, and she had not spoken aloud to another living soul since the fever that took their mother 4 winters back. She spoke to Eleanor in a language of small touches and steady looks that the 2 of them had built between them in the silent years. She spoke, in her own way, to the birds. The village had folded the 2 sisters into a single word, and the word was the one Mrs. Penhallow had used on the green, and it had cost them the things that words cost, the custom at the shop given grudgingly, and the change counted twice. The pews slid quietly to the back of the church, the invitations that came to every other cottage on the lane, and never to theirs. Eleanor set down the basket and built up the fire, and told her sister about the wren, how it had struck the glass, and lain stunned, and then gone up whole into the snow. And Beatrice smiled and pressed her palm flat to the cold glass, and the gulls outside seemed to settle, 3 of them folding their wings on the seawall, as though a hand had been laid on them. This was the thing Eleanor had learned to live inside. Not madness. A different way of listening taught at her father's knee and her mother's. A thing the world had no shelf to put it on, and so had called by the only name it had. She had reasons she did not explain. Their father had been a naturalist of small reputation and smaller fortune, a man who had taught both his daughters to watch the marsh the way other men watch the markets, to know a curlew from a redshank by the sound alone, to understand that a flock turning all at once meant a hawk before the eye could find it. He had died owing money to a man in the next valley, and the house had gone, and the daughters had come down to the cottage with 3 trunks, and their father's books, and a folded letter Eleanor had never opened because the seal was her father's, and breaking it felt like breaking him. That letter sat in the bottom of the smallest trunk. She knew it was there, the way you know a sore tooth is there. She had decided she would open it when she was strong enough, and 4 winters had taught her she was not yet strong enough, and so it waited. The man from the inn yard was the Duke, and the Duke had a problem the county did not know about, which was that his ward would not eat. The child was a girl of 7, named Posy, the daughter of his late cousin, delivered to the cold house above the marsh, with a trunk and a nurse, and a silence that no one in the household could break. She would not speak. She would not take more than a spoonful at the table. She sat at the high window of the great house and watched the marsh birds for hours, and the Duke, who had buried more grief in the last 2 years than most men carry in a lifetime, did not know what to do with a child who watched birds and would not eat, and so he watched her watching and felt the old helplessness rise. It was Posy who brought them together, though Eleanor did not understand that for some time. The child slipped her nurse on a gray afternoon, and the household went up like a struck hive. Footmen sent along the cliff path and the nurse weeping in the hall, and the Duke himself out with no hat and his coat unbuttoned, calling a name into the wind that did not answer, because the child it belonged to had never once answered to it. 2 hours of searching, the light going, the tide turning. It was Eleanor who found her. She had come out to the reeds as she did most afternoons, with Beatrice safe by the fire and a heel of bread in her pocket for the curlews, and she had seen the small figure at the water's edge, too still, too near the soft ground where the mud would take a child to the knee and hold her. She had not run. Running frightens wild things, and the child was a wild thing then. She had come slow and low along the bank, talking the whole way in the even voice she used for the stunned and the lost, and she had sat down in the cold reeds, an arm's length from the girl, and said nothing about the water or the danger or the searching house, and after a long while she had begun, very quietly, to name the birds. So when the Duke came down the path, at a near run, his face white with a fear he had not let himself feel until that moment, the fear of finding a small body in the mud, he found instead his silent ward, sitting dry and warm, in the reeds with her hand outstretched and a sanderling stepping delicately across her open palm, and the woman beside her saying, very softly, that the bird was not afraid, that it had only been waiting for someone quiet enough to come near. He did not call out. Some instinct, perhaps the same one that the marsh had given Eleanor, told him that a loud voice now would scatter more than the bird. The Duke stopped. He stood very still, the way he had stood in the inn yard, and he watched the woman. The county called Mad sit in the mud beside the child who would not be reached, and he saw the child lean by a few inches toward her. Eleanor looked up, and knew him and felt her stomach drop, because a woman of her reputation found alone with a duke's ward was a woman who could be ruined with a single sentence. And she gathered the child's hand into her own, and got slowly to her feet, ready for the sentence. He did not say, the sentence. He said, "Come up to the house." It was a command, level and quiet. And Eleanor heard in it only the authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed, and she rose with the child's hand in hers and the sanderling scattering away across the mud. And she went because she had no choice, and because Posy would not let go of her hand. What Eleanor could not hear, what the audience watching her could hear perfectly well, was the thing underneath the command. He had said come up to the house, because the alternative was watching her walk back to the cold, and he found to his own surprise that he could not. He did not understand it himself. He told himself it was concern for the child. In the great house, the fire was lit, and Posy ate. She ate a whole bowl of broth at the kitchen table with Eleanor beside her, spoon by spoon, the child watching Eleanor's face between each one as though checking that the woman was still there. And the cook stood in the doorway with her apron pressed to her mouth, because the child had not eaten a full meal in the 11 weeks since she had come. There was a thing Eleanor did that no one in the household had thought to do. She did not coax, she did not plead, or bribe, or fill the silence with bright talk. She sat and she ate her own bowl beside the child, unhurried, naming the birds that had come to the kitchen garden wall that morning. A robin, 2 finches, a wagtail at the water butt, and she let the child come to the food the way the sanderling had come to her hand, in its own time, when it judged the quiet safe. The Duke watched from the door of the kitchen a Place Dukes do not go, his shoulder against the frame, and his arms folded, and something working in his jaw that he did not let reach the rest of his face. He watched the woman. The county called Mad Cokes 3 spoonfuls, and then 6, then the whole bowl into a child who had refused everyone, and he understood that whatever this was, it was not madness. When Posy had finished, she did a thing she had not done since her arrival. She put her small hand flat against Eleanor's arm and left it there. Eleanor went very still, so as not to frighten it away, and across the kitchen the Duke saw the stillness and recognized it because it was his own, the stillness of a person who has learned that wanting a thing too openly is how you lose it. He said, "You will come again tomorrow." Another command. Eleanor, who had learned that nothing offered freely came without a price, looked for the price and could not find it, and that frightened her more than cruelty would have. She was aware, standing in the warm kitchen with a child's hand on her arm, of exactly where he stood in the room without looking at him, of the particular quality of his attention against the side of her face, the way you are aware of an open fire in a cold room. She told herself it was the warmth of the hearth. She knew, in the place that does not lie, that it was not. So began the strange winter of Eleanor Marsh. She came to the great house in the afternoons, and Posy ate, and slowly, in the way that frightened things thaw, the child began to make small sounds, not words yet, but the beginnings of them. A hum at the window, a single note. The Duke was often there, standing where dukes do not stand, in doorways and at the edges of rooms, watching with an attention he believed was perfectly concealed. Once in the library, reaching for the same volume of her father's old naturalist's plates that she had not known, the great house owned his hand, had come down beside hers on the spine, and neither of them had moved it for the length of a breath that went on too long. She had looked up. He had been already looking. There had been a moment, in the cold light off the marsh through the tall windows, when the distance between them had thinned to almost nothing, when he had leaned a fraction, and she had not stepped back, when a thing that had no name and needed none had stood plainly in the air between a duke and a woman the county called mad. Then a log had settled in the grate and the spell had broken, and he had drawn the book down and put it into her hands and stepped away, and she had carried it home and not slept. It was not concealed. Eleanor was the only one who could not see it. She read his stillness as coldness, and his commands as the impatience of a great man with a useful servant. And every evening she walked back to the cottage along the sea-wall and told herself she was a convenience and nothing more. And her body, walking, knew exactly where in the house he had been standing. The county noticed because the county noticed everything. Mrs. Penhallow, who had a niece, she had been steering toward the cold house since the day the Duke arrived, began to make remarks. The niece was Miss Caroline Vane, polished and pretty and possessed of £3,000, and a laugh she deployed like a fan, and she had been to the great house twice, and found the Duke heavy going, all silences and short answers and a gaze that went past her to the window. And she did not at all like hearing that the Marsh witch was there every afternoon feeding his ward, and somehow holding that gaze without trying. At the Aldous Winter Assembly, the first, the new Duke had hosted the ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, and the orchestra played and the diamonds of the county turned slowly under the light like a field of frost. And into this, Eleanor came in her plain gray gown, because Posy had begged her to come, and the Duke had sent the carriage himself. Miss Vane found her in the candlelight among all that brightness, and said, loudly enough for the nearest 6 people to hear, that it was a wonder his grace let the creature near the child, that everyone knew the Marsh girl talked to birds, and worse, that her own sister had not spoken a human word in years, and that madness, as everyone understood, ran in families like a bad title. The second voicing of the word In public this time. In a saturated, bright room where Eleanor stood like a moth among the moth's brighter cousins. The little knot of listeners did the thing crowds do. The half-turn, the lifted brow, the smile passed from face to face. Eleanor's hand, holding a glass she did not want, went very still. She set the glass down on the nearest table before it could betray her, before the tremor in her fingers could give the room the satisfaction it was waiting for. Across the room the Duke turned his head, and the turn was sharp, the only sudden motion in his whole still body all evening. And Miss Vane saw it, and mistook it for interest in herself, and lifted her chin, and laughed her practiced laugh. It was at that assembly that Eleanor saw the portrait. It hung in the long gallery, half in shadow, turned slightly to the wall as though someone had wished to hide it, and lacked the heart to take it down. And it showed a young woman with a child in her arms, and a window behind her full of marsh light. Eleanor stood before it longer than she should have, and a voice behind her, low and level, said that it was his wife. The Duke had come up the gallery without sound. He said that her name had been Helena, and that she had died of the same fever that swept the coast 4 years past, the child in her arms not yet a year old, and that the child had not lived either. He said it the way a man reads from a ledger, all the feeling pressed flat beneath the words, and Eleanor understood in that moment the whole architecture of his stillness. He had not been cold. He had been carrying this. He had taken in Posy, his cousin's orphaned daughter, because she was a child who watched birds at a window, and he had not been able to reach her, and every day she did not eat, he had relived a death he had been unable to prevent. The wound, named once in a half-dark gallery, never to be explained again. He turned the portrait a little further to the wall, he said, "I have told no one that—" and then he walked away, down the gallery, and Eleanor stood with her heart going like a trapped wing, and understood that she had been led into something she did not know how to hold. You are perhaps beginning to see what she could not. Stay close. The world had not finished with Eleanor, and neither had he. Spring came late to the marsh that year, and with it came the entail. The man in the next valley, to whom her father had owed money, was named Mr. Silas Croft. And he had not forgotten the debt, and he had recently learned 2 things that pleased him. The first was that the cottage and the strip of marsh it sat upon had reverted, through a tangle of her father's careless paper, to the estate Croft had bought at the foreclosure. The second was that Eleanor, debtor's daughter, Marsh Witch, was spending her afternoons at the Duke of Aldous' house, and that a connection to a duke, however irregular, was a thing a rising man might turn to his advantage. Croft came to the cottage on a bright, cold morning, and stood in the doorway too long and made his offer, which was marriage, and which was not really an offer at all but the closing of a door. He had the paper that said the cottage was his. He could put the sisters out by Lady Day, or Eleanor could be sensible, and marry him and keep her strange sister housed and fed, and all it would cost her was everything. Eleanor did not faint, and did not weep. She said she would think on it, because a woman with a silent sister and no roof of her own cannot afford the luxury of a flat refusal, and Croft smiled as though he had already won, and told her not to think too long. When he had gone, she stood in the cold cottage, with Beatrice's hand in hers, and felt the walls of her life draw in. She did not go to the great house that afternoon. She could not have hidden it from him, and she was not yet willing to let the Duke of Aldous see her as a problem to be solved, a debt to be settled, one more grief delivered to his cold door. Posy would not eat when Eleanor did not come, and after 2 days the Duke himself came down the marsh path to the cottage, which set every curtain in the village twitching, and he stood at the low door he had to stoop beneath, and he saw at once that something was wrong. He did not ask. He looked at her face, and at the bare, cold room, and at the silent sister at the window, and he said, "Eat something. You have not been eating." And it was a command, and it was the most tender thing anyone had said to Eleanor in 4 years. She did not break. She told him in the plain, honest way she fell into, only when her values were cornered, that Mr. Dollar Croft held the paper on the cottage and had offered her marriage, and that she would likely take it, because her sister could not be put out into the cold, that she was grateful for all his grace had done for her, and that Posy was a dear child and would do well now. She said it all in a level voice with her chin up, and the Duke, who had spent 2 years pressing his feeling flat beneath ledger words, stood in her doorway and let her watch his face change. He said one word. He said no. Not no as a man refuses a request. No as a man refuses to let a thing happen. He said that Croft would not have the cottage and would not have her, and he turned and was gone up the path before she could ask how a duke meant to unmake a debt that was legally sound. And Eleanor stood in the doorway and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the dangerous warmth of being defended. She told herself not to trust it. Her body did not listen. Her body had known where he stood in every room for a whole winter, and it knew now that he had crossed a marsh in the cold for her, and it was tired of being told he did not mean it. What followed was the dark of the year. Though spring was on the marsh, Croft did not take a refusal from a duke any better than from a debtor's daughter. He went to work the way small, clever, cruel men go to work. In whispers, in the right ears, and within a fortnight the county had a new and better story. The Duke of Aldous, it was said, had taken the Marsh Witch as his mistress. The afternoons at the great house, the child as a pretext, the visit to the cottage that half the village had seen. Mrs. Penhallow carried the tale to the vicarage, and the vicarage carried it everywhere, and Miss Vane, who had her own reasons, gave it polish. By the time it reached its peak, it was no longer whispered. At the spring assembly, the great public gathering of the county, in the very ballroom where Eleanor had stood among the diamonds in her grey gown, Mrs. Sintis, Penhallow said it to her face, in the third and cruelest voicing, before a ring of listening people. "We all know what you are," she said. "The mad marsh girl, talking to her birds and now talking her way into a duke's bed. She has nothing, and she will leave with nothing, and she has dragged a good family's name into the marsh mud with her. The room went the particular quiet of a room that has heard something it will repeat for a year." Eleanor stood in the center of it. She had worn the grey gown again because it was the only good gown she owned, and she stood very straight in it, her father's daughter. And she did not weep, and she did not answer, because there was no answer that the room would hear. She could feel the eyes on her like a change in the weather, the slow swivel of the whole assembly toward the woman at its center, the fans lifted to cover mouths that were already moving. Croft was by the door with his arms folded, satisfied, watching his winter's work come to its harvest. Miss Vane stood at Mrs. Prass. Penhallow sighed with her chin lifted, and there was on her face not cruelty exactly, but the calm of a woman seeing the natural order restored, the marsh witch put back in the marsh, the correct people left in possession of the bright warm room. Eleanor looked for the Duke and could not find him, and the not finding was the worst thing of all. Worse than the words, because she had let herself believe, and now in the moment she needed him the room had him absent and the old message of her life rose up clear and cold. No one would choose her. She had always known it. She had let a winter of warm kitchens and a hand beside hers on a book spine teach her to forget it, and that had been the foolishness. Not the forgetting, but the believing. And now the bill for the believing had come due in front of the whole county. She turned to leave, her head high, her hands steady, the snow of the green 4 months gone but the cold of it back in her chest. And she had reached the great doors when his voice came across the whole length of the room. He had been in the gallery. He had been standing before the portrait of Helena, turned now fully to the room because that morning he had done a thing he had not done in 2 years, and looked his grief full in the face, and decided he would not let it cost him a living woman as well as a dead one. He came down the length of the ballroom, and the crowd parted because crowds part for dukes, and he crossed the floor in the deliberate, unhurried way of a man who has already decided everything, and he stopped before Eleanor in the center of the room, where the whole county could see. He did not raise his voice. The room was silent enough that he did not need to. He said, "Miss Marsh has agreed to be my wife." The line landed in the silence the description had built, and for the length of a held breath, no one in the room moved. It was not poetry. It was procedure, and it was emotion, welded into the smallest possible space. A name claimed, a future declared, a door that no whisper could unsay. Mrs. Penhallow's fan stopped its motion. Her mouth opened and produced nothing. Miss Vane went the color of the wall behind her. By the door, Croft uncrossed his arms, and a gentleman beside him, a senior magistrate of the county who had been listening to the whole exchange with growing distaste, remarked in a carrying voice that he would be glad to look into the matter of the foreclosure paper, as he had heard there were irregularities in how the late Mr. Spurt Marsh's affairs had been wound up, and that any man holding a doubtful title might wish to be very sure of his ground. Croft's satisfaction drained out of his face. The hierarchy, which had taken the whole winter to render its verdict, reversed itself in the space of 3 sentences in the same bright room where it had been pronounced. Eleanor did not hear most of it. She heard the line. She stood in the center of the ballroom with the candlelight on her plain gray gown and the whole county's eyes upon her, and she looked up at the Duke of Aldous and found his face for once entirely unguarded, the stillness gone, everything he had pressed flat for 2 years, showing plain, and she understood that he had not been absent in her hour of need. He had been making a decision. She did not say yes in the ballroom. She said it later, quietly, where it belonged to no one but the 2 of them. In the ballroom, she only put her hand into his offered hand, her bare fingers against his, and the room saw a debtor's daughter take a duke's hand, and did not yet know that it had also seen a woman who had been told her whole life that she was unchoosable, be at last and in public. The matter of the foreclosure unwound as such matters do, when a magistrate takes an interest, and a wronged man's papers are examined by someone who wishes to find the truth. Croft's title to the cottage proved as doubtful as the magistrate had suspected, built on a debt inflated past its true sum, and a foreclosure rushed through while the daughters grieved. And Croft, faced with the prospect of a closer look at all his recent acquisitions, found pressing business in another county, and was not seen at the Wexford assemblies again. He was not destroyed. He was merely displaced, removed from the board, sent off to be confidently wrong somewhere else. The cottage came back to Eleanor clear and clean, and she did not need it any longer, but she kept it, because some things you keep. There was the matter, too, of the letter. On the evening before her wedding, Eleanor sat by the fire in the great house that was to be her home, and she took from the smallest trunk the folded letter with her father's seal that had waited 4 winters for her to be strong enough, and she found that she was strong enough at last. She broke the seal. Her father had written it knowing he was dying, and it was not the apology she had braced for, nor the confession of the debt, though that was in it. It was mostly about the birds. He had written to tell his daughters that the way they listened was not an affliction, and never had been, that their mother had listened the same way, that the Marsh had spoken to 3 generations of the women of their blood, and that he had married into the family precisely because Eleanor's mother had once told him, on a gray shore, that the gulls were uneasy, and a storm was coming, and the storm had come. He had written, in his last weeks, to tell them that they were not mad. They were only awake to a thing the world had gone deaf to. Eleanor read it twice, and folded it again, and understood that the message she had been afraid to open had been all along permission to be exactly what she was. They were married in the small church at the marsh edge in the early summer, not in the great county church where the verdict had been pronounced, but in the plain stone chapel where the Marsh sisters had always sat at the back, and the village came because villages will always come, and some came ashamed, and some came glad, and the Duke did not appear to distinguish between them. Beatrice stood up with her sister, and at the moment the vicar asked for the giving of the bride, in the quiet of the listening chapel, Beatrice spoke. She said her sister's name aloud, the first human word she had spoken, in 4 years, clear and small in the stone-cold air. Eleanor turned. The whole church turned. And outside the open chapel door, as if the marsh itself had been listening, a flock of starlings lifted off the sea-wall all at once and turned in the bright air the way her father had taught her. A flock turns all together for joy or for warning, and on that morning it was joy. The cold house above the marsh was not cold after that. They came home to it, the Duke and his wife, and the child who now ate at the table and spoke in whole sentences and laughed, and the great fire was lit in the gallery, and the portrait of Helena was no longer turned to the wall. Eleanor had asked that it be hung straight in the light with a small marsh flower in a glass beneath it, because a house should be allowed to remember its dead without hiding them, and the Duke had stood before it a long while and then had done as she asked, and something in him that had been clenched for 2 years had let go. It is a good place to leave them, in the warm gallery, with the fire going, and the spring light coming off the marsh through the tall windows. Yet the story does not end on the portrait. It ends on the smallest of the things in the great house which Eleanor carried up from the cottage and set on the mantel in the room that was now hers, where she could see it from the chair by the fire. It was her father's folded letter, the seal broken at last, the paper soft from being read. She did not need to read it again. She knew it now the way she knew the names of the things that flew. On winter evenings, when the snow came in off the gray water the way it had come on the morning of the harvest fair, she would sit by the fire with Posy leaning warm against her side, and Beatrice at the window, naming the gulls in her small recovered voice. And the Duke in the chair across the hearth, watching his wife the way he had once watched a woman kneel on cold cobbles to warm a dying bird, and the letter would be there on the mantel, plain and worn and enough. She had been called mad for talking to the marsh and the things that lived in it. The world had decided what she was and built a word to hold her, and it had used that word at the harvest fair, and again in a candle-lit ballroom, and again before the whole county, 3 times, in 3 different rooms, each time certain it was right. And then a letter had arrived, 4 winters late, written by a dying man who had loved her, and it had told her the truth. The world could not. She was not mad. She had only been listening, the way her mother had listened on a gray shore, the way 3 generations of the women of her blood had listened, to a marsh that had always been speaking to anyone quiet enough to hear it. The world had merely gone deaf and called its own deafness sanity. And on the night the snow returned, in the warm house above the marsh, with everyone she loved gathered close in the firelight, Eleanor sat very still and listened, and for once the world was quiet enough to hear what she had always heard, and it was beautiful. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's winter. If her story moved you, leave a word below with the moment that stayed with you, and we will go on telling the quiet ones together.